Hi, folks. Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. Um, my name is Melissa, she, her pronouns. I'm the Senior Distributed Organizer for Sierra Club, Pennsylvania, and I'm facilitating our Clean Energy for All series. You are here at our very special episode of this webinar series, Action in a Time of Anxiety, Honoring Our Climate Emotions While Fighting for a Better Future. So unlike in past webinars where we're very focused on, a particular environmental issue, we're taking a little bit of a different approach tonight where we're talking about the impact of what's going on in the world on all of us and how we continue to do this work. Zoom setup, do stay on mute if you're not speaking. There will be time at the end for discussion. So we are asking that everyone please stay on mute until the end. If you do have a question as we are going along that you really want to get out there, go ahead and put it into the chat. I may not see it. Our speakers may not see it, though, live in real time. And so if it is something that we need to answer at the end, we will wait to do so. Automated closed captions are running. And then when we do get to the discussion portion, if you could use your raised hand function under reactions to make your question or your comment, that will help us stay ordered because we do have a lot of folks who registered for this evening. Some community agreements. As always, engage with kindness. No forms of discrimination will be tolerated. We will be moderating chat and the discussion, so any disruptions will result in being removed from this space. Speak from your own experience. If you do find yourself speaking a lot, be sure to leave space for others. Like I said, we're going to have a lot of people joining us here this evening. We want to make sure everyone has the chance to engage. We're going to try not to use jargon, acronyms, or industry language, but do please ask us to clarify if something doesn't make sense. And you can ask that right in the chat. And our excellent support person here this evening, Kelsey Krebs, will do her best to fix that acronym for you and explain that for us. So thank you, Kelsey, for being here tonight for that support. If you're having tech problems, you can ask that in the chat as well. We may ask you to continue a conversation outside of this event in the interest of time. If what you're talking about needs a little bit more time, we can certainly have a one-on-one conversation or an interaction over email to address any concerns that you have. And we might not have all the answers here tonight, right? So we're always happy to follow up with you afterwards if needed. And this is not necessarily a therapy space. We want you to be aware that if you or someone you know is in crisis, please call or text 988 or chat 988lifeline.org. And this is part of our Clean Energy for All series. If you are interested in seeing some past episodes, you can check out the video list there at that link. And then our future editions, again, we're going to go back to talking about our energy topics in Pennsylvania and our future editions. So I hope you'll join us for those. And then our agenda today, we're going to hear first from Bailey Fullwiler, an eco-social worker. She has an incredible presentation for us. And then we are going to have a short little panel of Sierra Club, Pennsylvania staff. We want to be vulnerable with you and talk about how these topics impact us. So you'll hear from the three of us, and then we will have discussion time. All right, so I want to welcome Bailey. Bailey is a workplace mental health consultant that supports climate and environmental organizations in organizational and community level approaches to resilience. Bailey's background is in social work and supporting communities in navigating mental health impacts of climate injustice and environmental trauma. In addition to her workplace consulting, Bailey researches ecological grief and partners with environmental groups to honor the grief around environmental degradation or species loss through facilitated support groups and ecological mourning practices. Outside of her roles, Bailey is a trauma-informed yoga instructor who teaches with the nonprofit Queer Behavior and in local halfway houses. So with that, I'm going to close out of my screen sharing and turn it over to Bailey. All right, thanks so much, Bailey. Take it away.
Hey, y'all. Good evening. I'm very happy to be with you today. So we are going to start with an invitation for a short grounding practice. For those that are curious about what the word grounding means, I'm just talking about a moment to pause and check in with yourself. And so know that you're welcome to participate as much or as little as makes sense for you. I usually invite folks to turn off their screen because I feel like that can help folks be a little more comfortable so they know, they don't have to worry about how they look in the moment. But for our grounding practice, this will just be 1 minute. And my invitation is that if you're in a seated position, you come to the edge of your chair and that you have your feet on the ground. It might feel nice to wiggle your toes or press them against your shoes or the floor beneath that and feel that sensation of something underneath you. And then an invitation, if it feels okay, to take your hands and place them gently over your eyes with your pinkies meeting. Your eyes can be soft or closed here. You might take a moment to take a longer inhale than you have, and then a long, slow exhale, letting the warmth of your hands help relax the muscles around your eyes. And we'll just take 2 more breaths together. Long inhale through the nose. And if it feels good, you could sigh the exhale out your mouth. One more time. Long, slow inhale. Long, slow exhale. And then you can let your hands fall away from your eyes. That practice is sometimes called eye resting. I do it if I'm working on a screen a lot. Um, but yeah. Just wanting to start off slow. So, like Melissa shared, I work with organizations and community groups that have been impacted by environmental degradation. A lot of times that looks like fracking, waste incineration, oil and gas projects, the usual suspects. And so we know that we don't exist in a vacuum. So anything happening in our communities also impacts our mental health. And so the way that I like to introduce this is through the ecological health model. And so folks might be familiar with social determinants of health. The ecological health model is very similar, and it looks about how your environment impacts you and your community. And so on the outside, we see things like climate stability and biodiversity. And then we come down from the natural environment to the built environment, how we move around our communities, coming down to the individual level. And so this just ecological model helps us think through what all could be impacting the well-being of a person, knowing that it's very hard to be healthy in an unhealthy environment. And what do we mean by health? The other thing I like to define is emotions. And so emotions are just signals from our brain. They're reactions, they're bits of information. They really don't last as long as a lot of people think. You might feel like you're in a funk and you're kind of stuck in an emotion. The reaction that our brain sends that lets us know that we're having emotion really can occur and conclude for most people in about 2 minutes. Now, that's not to say that emotions don't come back up as we have stimulus that keeps prompting that response. But by and large, I just think of emotions as pieces of information that my brain is giving me about what's going on in the world and how it's impacting me. And so there's a lot of groups such as the Climate Mental Health Network, who I really love and adore, that have been trying to support individuals and communities think about how acts of climate distress and environmental degradation might be impacting our mental health. And one example of that is they built this beautiful climate emotions wheel. And as you can see, it's not all what we would call quote unquote negative emotions, right? There's also positive emotions. So whether that's interest, empathy, gratitude, inspiration, hope, all of that is here, and there can also be anger or sadness or fear. And then we can get more specific about what are we really feeling in response to certain events or situations. And so that's just one way that I like to frame this conversation of, you know, we are impacted by the world we live in and by the communities that we live in. And so it's really natural that for some folks, especially if they care about the environment, that they might have an emotional response to events that happen. One example that I'll give is that when I first started studying ecological grief, I was working in a couple different zoological associations, and we were noticing some really big mental health impacts from species extinction. And so it's really understandable that if you spend your whole life caring for and protecting species, it would have an impact on you if that species went extinct. So hopefully that's a helpful framing for our conversation. When we talk about the scope of intersection, a lot of times people ask me like, how big of a problem is this? Is it really a problem? And the answer is, it's a problem for the people it's a problem for, and maybe for people that you love, they're impacted by this too. And so when we look at who's impacted, like whose mental health is impacted by environmental degradation or climate change, it really matters how close you are to the impact. If you live a mile within a fracking pad, there's a pretty good chance that your mental health is impacted by that fracking pad. Um, if you live by a waterway that's been contaminated, there's a really good chance that that impacts your day-to-day life, and that's going to impact your mental health. So when you look at that, proximity is a big matter for looking at who's most impacted by an emotional response to climate change or environmental degradation. We also look at connection to the environmental with the natural environment. So I work with a lot of birding groups, groups that are paying really close attention to their local environment and changes in it. So obviously, if you're connected to your natural environment and you're paying attention, that's more likely that you'll be impacted. I work a lot with farmers, with sometimes ranchers and hunting groups, folks that have strong ties to their local land and their natural landscape and assets. And so they're going to be really impacted by changes in our climate stability and by, natural disasters. And then there's individual characteristics. So, if you're somebody who's already navigating depression, anxiety, bipolar, if you've already navigating a mental health stressor, then having an environmental stressor is going to amp that up potentially. Not always, not for everybody. These are just, some things that might influence those who might feel more impacted emotionally and behaviorally by climate change and then environmental degradation. When we talk about prevalence, the Yale program on climate communication has done the best studies when we look at the United States. Their 2020 survey looked about 7% of US adults reported feeling serious climate distress. And so that means it's impacting their day-to-day life. Another 16% of US adults said they felt one or more symptoms on a daily or weekly basis of climate distress. This varies a lot by generation, so millennials and Gen Z made up a bigger population of those US adults that were feeling impacted. Something I like to note is that a lot of times climate distress is cyclical. So, like for communities that experience wildfires or droughts, we know that there are seasons, so those seasons are changing. And so, 6 months out of the year, it might not impact your mental health very much. And then during those events that are stressful or leading up to a season that is stressful, that might pick up. A lot of farmers that I work with here in the Ohio River Valley, their mental health tends to get impacted a lot with like anticipatory grief or anxiety leading up to harvest season if they know like they've been experiencing drought or different conditions that have made it harder for them year by year. One thing I'll say is that the measurements are not perfect for this. Like, I just like to be transparent and honest. We do not have consistent standards and measurements like we would for diagnosing, say, major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder. And that's because climate emotions are not diagnosable. They're a really normal, healthy response to stressors in your environment. And so that is an issue we have with how prevalent is this issue. A lot of times I tell folks we just don't know because we don't have standard measurements right now. There's a lot of interest in working on that in the United States and globally. But I would say Just for me personally, I tend to get somewhere between 100 and 150 individuals who call me each year seeking mental health support around climate distress. And I work with anywhere between 10 and 20 organizations where they feel their staff or volunteers need more support. That's a little bit about like how big is the issue. It just depends. It varies by community, by population, by occupation. But, it's impacting some people. And even if it's not impacting you, it might be impacting someone you love. So it's good to know a little bit about what's going on. When people ask me, what is causing this distress, I try to remind people that climate distress is just stress. And we know that stress is really impactful on our physical health and our mental health. And so climate distress and environmental degradation causes changes to our daily routines. It impacts our ability to gauge and pro-social behaviors. I remember I got a lot of calls last summer when there was wildfire smoke that was impacting the air quality of people sharing like, I'm going crazy, like I want my kids to go outside. It's summer, we're busy, but the air quality is not safe. Like I just, I can't deal with this. Like there was no pro-social outlet that they had available to them in that moment, and that's really understandable. And for those that live near polluting facilities that get shelter-in-place warnings or have to evacuate, it's this huge disruption of your routine, which causes stress. When we look at mental health, especially when we look at suicidal ideation, one of the things we worry a lot about is a sense of hopelessness. One thing that climate distress causes is a difficulty planning for the future or envisioning a positive future. And so that's one thing that I worry about a lot and work on a lot for suicide prevention for communities that are most impacted. It's just this sense of hopelessness that things aren't going to get better or you can't have the future that you wanted. We know that extreme weather is difficult. The most clear example that I have, especially where I am in Ohio, is these heat waves. Heat waves have been really challenging for my community because they impact the effectiveness of psychotropic medications. Again, that's a risk factor for those already struggling with their mental health. And we know that extreme heat also has increases in aggression and violent crime that happens. And so it just causes these community level stressors that then impact folks' mental health. So more correlation than causation in that case. There's folks that struggle with the constant exposure to secondary trauma through media coverage, especially if you're somebody who's online a lot or you have to be for work. It can be really hard to take in all of that information. And then we also know that there's negative health impacts for living near polluting facilities, especially if you live near oil and gas facilities. Noise pollution has a huge impact on your physical health. So does sleep deprivation and the ability to access green and blue spaces. So all things that folks are familiar with, it's just framing it and helping us understand why would people be having a emotional response to climate change, because it's disruptive. It's incredibly disruptive. It causes stress, and then stress impacts our physical and mental health. So nothing new, just a different way of thinking about it. It's helpful for some folks that I work with to have a shared language. And so you might be familiar with these terms: climate or eco-anxiety, solastalgia, climate or ecological grief. I find that Western cultures really struggle with this idea of grief or mourning for the natural world, but it shows up in a lot of the communities I serve. And then there's been more focus recently on climate or environmental trauma. And so how collective events or these big events cause collective trauma. And so you'll have access to all of these slides so you can have these definitions or resources, but climate anxiety would be the term that I think folks are most familiar with and that I get called for the most. It's this heightened emotional, mental, or somatic distress in response to dangerous changes in the climate system. This definition comes from the Climate Psychology Alliance, which is a wonderful group that will be highlighted in the resource guide you get after this. Some things to think about with that is this is typically anxiety is anticipatory, so it's concern for the future. So it makes a lot of sense that we would feel anxious about the future when we're experiencing environmental degradation and harm. It can be adaptive. And so sometimes those climate Anxiety emotions can prompt people to act or connect with others that are experiencing the same thing, and in that way can be adaptive. Anger is a really common symptom or expression that shows up with climate anxiety. And this is a really normal response for humans. We have a fairness bias. And so a lot of times anger shows up at injustice. And so it's a really normal response for people to feel anxious and angry about the future. And right now, depending on where you live, some folks are navigating current stressors and some folks are worried about future stressors, depending on where you live. And again, we don't have standard measurements for this, so it's really hard to say how many people are impacted by this because we don't all measure it the same way across the United States. Ecological grief is like my I don't know, my home base. I work a lot with communities that have experienced species loss or damage or degradation to landscapes. Mountaintop removal is a really like obvious example of this in communities that I've supported, in which the landscape has been changed or there's been a loss. And any loss or big change like this can bring up feelings of grief. Not for everybody, not all the time, but anytime we experience a loss, we can experience grief with that, and there's ways that we can mourn nature, and environmental changes. There's different types of ecological grief, so sometimes it's that physical loss, sometimes it's culture. I've worked with, a few communities, especially farming and indigenous communities that have had loss of culture and stories around environmental degradation, and then anticipatory grief. So just like if you found out somebody you loved had a diagnosis, like a health diagnosis, and you were going to lose them in a certain amount of time, people can feel that grief ahead of time or start grieving that loss before it happens. And you can feel the same anticipatory loss for nature or for species. Solastalgia is a term that's helpful for some and not for others. It's from an Australian scientist called Dr. Glenn Albert. And it relates to this distress around environmental change in which your home no longer feels like your home. A lot of communities that have experienced environmental disasters talk about no longer feeling safe or a sense of solace at home or feeling homesick for a home that no longer exists. And so again, not everybody may feel this, but this term can be helpful for some folks if you've experienced an act of environmental degradation or harm. And then trauma is the name of the game in 2025. I think, post-COVID, folks are very familiar with the language of trauma. Any disturbing experience that can result in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, or confusion, or any disruptive feeling that's intense and long-lasting, is what we're talking about with trauma. And so trauma is less specific to an event and more about a reaction to an event. And there can be differences in whether that's acute or chronic. And so whether it's a one-time large event or an ongoing event, especially with groups that I work with that experience severe and persistent drought or have been hit with multiple disasters. I was working with a community that got hit with 3 hurricanes in a 7-month period. And so there's this chronic never being able to feel safe because you keep getting hit. And so again, you'll have these slides, but this is just language that might be helpful for folks. And the other term I like to offer for those volunteering or working in the climate movement is moral distress. This is a term that came out of healthcare, specifically looking at nursing, but it's been applied to other first responders and community groups. And it is the impact of when you know the right thing to do, but institutional constraints make it impossible or nearly impossible to pursue the right course of action. And so sometimes organizations that I work with, environmental groups, experience moral distress, whether it's because of funders, and so they might have funding restrictions on what they are or aren't able to do, which can cause moral distress. And sometimes it's about the scale of the projects that they're working on. And so again, this language applies to some folks, but not others, but it's helpful to know the language so that we can connect around a mutual experience, or if you notice that somebody else is struggling with something, to help them, give them language and understand what's happening. Okay, now we need to talk about the good stuff, which is what keeps us safe or what keeps us well in these moments. For individual protective factors, so these things that build resilience, one thing that we like to talk a lot about is community practices. And so, for folks that exist in cultures that have rituals to respond to ecological damages, they tend to do a lot better or to honor human nature connection. There's a lot of writing that you can find in the resource guide that I have for you all that looks at community level practices for honoring our connection to nature and how we're impacted when nature is harmed. Having existing coping skills is really important. In particular, we find that self-compassion practices are really protective for burnout, which is a big topic in environmental groups of feeling burnt out as volunteers or staff. And I have practices around that to support folks. But when I'm working with organizations and volunteers, we look at what are the existing coping skills that you have and how can we build them into our organization or into our daily habits to better support folks. Being a part of a supportive community. And so isolation, as we know, is bad for our mental health, but especially with climate change, we want to be connected to a like-minded community where we can take collective action. And so a lot of times when I get a call from somebody who's looking for support around climate distress, one of the first things we look a part of is, are you a part of an organization or group? And if you are you able to express your concerns there, or do you get kind of knocked down? And sometimes we can have in environmental groups this resistance to people sharing their concerns, whether that's a habit towards like we want to look at the positive, or folks don't want people to despair, they want them to act. They can be really well intentioned, but what we end up teaching people is they can't share their concerns or emotions. And so sometimes we work on that with different groups that I consult with is how can you build the skills to be able to hear people's concerns without trying to minimize them or redirect them? Having the capacity to just listen to somebody's concerns and validate that we are experiencing a lot of environmental harms, and we are seeing climate instability, and that's really scary and it brings up a lot of emotions for different people. And then the other protective factor that I really love to talk about is intergenerational relationships. And so connecting elders in the climate movement with youth in the climate movement has shown a lot of great mental health benefits for both sides, from both youth that are feeling anxious and older adults that I work with that have been feeling ecological grief. And so I'll have more about these practices in your resource guide, and I'm always happy to connect with people one-on-one if they want to talk about building up individual practices to support their well-being. And then organizational practices, this is what I work with the most time. And I'm just picking out like the really fun ones here. Obviously, there's more, but celebrating any level of win is really important. And what I found with consulting clients is it is not enough just to send out an email or make a social media post. To get the mental health benefits of celebrating a win, you really need to come together, to chant, to dance, to celebrate, to eat, to like soak in the goodness. Like you actually have to take time to do the somatic and social aspects of celebrating to get the mental health benefits. I also work with environmental groups to build their trauma-informed organizational practices, so skills like critical incident debriefing, getting people managers trained in trauma-informed supervision, helping folks develop policies for flexible work schedules, training staff, especially if they're canvassing or doing outreach and skills like mental health first aid. And then sometimes we look at having specific pockets of paid time off after disaster response and distress to help support staff and volunteers who are doing that outreach. And then building up organizational care resources. So making sure that your employee assistant program is meeting the needs of your staff and volunteers. And a lot of times I work on helping environmental groups build up referral relationships with local behavioral health providers, and then training those behavioral health providers in the specific challenges that organizers and activists are experiencing. I'm pretty sure that I'm out of time. So you have these slides if you need them, and we'll get on to the panel. But one final thought.
Keep going, Bailey. Go ahead and finish your slides, please.
I'm sorry, I always try to fit too much like topic into one thing. The big thing that I always want to talk to folks about as we're leaving these conversations is ideally you want to have self-soothing practices, self-care practices, and then community care practices. Self-soothing are the things that you do that provide immediate relief and comfort when you're experiencing distress. And so that can be like getting your favorite treat, taking a bubble bath, watching your comfort TV show, calling a loved one, these things that are immediately going to help you co-regulate or self-regulate. And so it's really important to have those things that immediately support you and make you feel better when you experience distress. However, those things don't typically build your resilience so that you're better able to navigate stressors in the long run. And for those, you need self-care practices. And so, like it's called, a self-care practice is something you consistently do. They don't always feel good in the moment, but they build your resilience and they should be proactive. So they're things that you need to be doing all the time so that when the stressing events come up, you have built up that resilience opposed to always needing to self-soothe. And so there's lots of examples of self-care practices that folks are familiar with, whether that's having a gratitude journal, going to therapy, getting enough sleep, these basic things that we maybe do every day or multiple times a week that are going to build us up. And the other thing we really need for our resilience is to be connected with other people, especially ones that we feel safe around and can share our emotions with. And so we also want to look at community care, whether that's with your staff or volunteers or within your friend group, of having time dedicated to coming together and like actually checking in on each other. And so a lot of times when I'm working with environmental groups, we start to build in with their volunteer managers time for volunteers to actually like connect and get to know each other, and so they can build relationships and start with community care practices, whether that's a grounding practice at the beginning or doing something fun together, like an art therapy practice, but building up so that you're not always doing this alone, that you're doing it with community. And so I love talking about these 3 buckets of care. And if that's something that's ever of interest to you, feel welcome to reach out to my email. These are just low-hanging fruit practices that anyone can like pretty easily integrate into their day-to-day life. So if you're looking for support, you'll have these slides, and I can also talk you through how you could integrate any of these practices into the work that you're already doing. And then you'll have my resource guide. Okay. I'm sorry for going over time.
No worries. Thank you so much, Bailey. So I so appreciate you taking the time to share that in-depth look at what we're feeling. And I think it really validates a lot of what we're all going through, right? So I really appreciate your expert approach on this. And I look forward to going through the resource guide. So folks, you're going to get those slides and Bailey's resource guide in your email sometime in the next couple of days so that you can look back and start kind of considering those self-care things. Okay, so we are now going to go to, let me reopen let me get it to work and reopen our slides here. So I have our prompts for what? Okay, can folks see that? It was giving me, we're good. Okay, cool. Sorry about that. Okay, so we want to be vulnerable with you all, right? So we're kind of stepping out of our probably our comfort zone here, and we want to talk a little bit about how we at the Pennsylvania chapter, or at least 3 of us, are dealing with these emotions because we're going through it with you. We're experiencing it. We're hearing it from y'all. In fact, this webinar was born out of conversations that I had with some of our volunteers about how they were struggling after the election. And so, yeah, we're going to be a little bit vulnerable. You're going to hear first from Tom, our chapter director, and then from Sarah, our deputy director, and then a little bit more from me, depending on our time. These are the prompts that I issued all of us. We are not going to answer these like their homework. We're going to kind of do a free flow conversation. But the prompts that I offered were: what motivates you to continue to do this work, even when it feels impossible or overwhelming? What does hope mean to you? What activities help you recharge your emotional battery? EV pun. What resources have helped you feel more resilient? So once again, I will close out of screen sharing, probably break it, and then pass it over to Tom to kind of give his perspective on this. Go ahead, Tom.
Thanks, Melissa. And I do want to say completely unironically and truthfully that one of the things that helps me do this job is you all, the team of staff and volunteer leaders that I work with are amazing, and I just love trying to do our best with y'all, even though it doesn't always work. And I think community is very important in times like this. I'm gonna talk mostly to the hope issue. And I do want to include a trigger warning. I'm going to be talking about suicide. Hope is really, really important in work like this. And it's also very complicated. And I think it can actually be harmful sometimes. And it's a little bit tricky sometimes to remain hopeful while also not deceiving myself. I had a personal struggle with hope in the fall of 2021. This was before the passage of the Federal Inflation Reduction Act. And if you remember back then, there was a lot of urgency being felt around getting a climate bill passed before the 2022 midterm elections, when everyone expected the Democrats to lose their trifecta. And at one point, it looked very much like Senators Manchin and Sinema were just not going to get on board no matter what. And we were going to miss our last real chance of any meaningful federal climate legislation. And it was at that time that a friend and coworker of mine went missing. And a few days later, he was found dead in the water of an apparent suicide. He was an incredibly smart, goofy, creative, and caring person, and it was very shocking to me and to other people who worked with him. And I don't know for a fact whether hopelessness over the climate crisis was his trigger, but the timing was suspicious, and I knew that he cared very, very deeply about this. And the issue was very much on my mind, and his death made me hyper aware of my own mental health and the possibility that many people who work or volunteer a lot of time in this field are not emotionally well. And so it caused me to do a lot of soul searching about whether and how there was any hope of solving what I truly believe to be the greatest crisis of our time. And I don't have time today to rehash that whole emotional journey, but I'm happy to happy to riff with people offline. But to oversimplify things, I would say that I've arrived at a state of personal acceptance that it is actually too late to fix the problem. And that was actually paradoxically very emotionally liberating. And this kind of acceptance is the premise of a book, which I really highly recommend. And Melissa actually pointed out to me originally. It's called I Want a Better Catastrophe by Andrew Boyd. And when he says better, he means less terrible, more manageable. kind of accepting that things are going to get tough, but we can still affect how things go down, right? And um, uh, make the catastrophe less bad. And the thing that really stands out for me in this was a chapter on the categories of hope. And thank you for the chat. There's a link here that is an excerpt from the book. If you don't feel like reading the whole book, although hopefully you will, that deals with the categories of hope as kind of laid out by a Norwegian psychologist and Green Party politician named Per Espen Stoknes, which I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he outlined these four kinds of hope, which I think were really useful for me in thinking about, okay, what is it that I'm actually feeling right now, and what is helpful. And the first one is passive hope, which is super positive, kind of the attitude that, don't worry, everything's going to be all right. And I think most of us who are here, who recognize the science of climate change, realize that it's not really supportive of that attitude, but it can make you feel good. Unfortunately, it doesn't give you a lot of reason to try to change anything. Kind of the opposite of that is heroic hope, which is the attitude that we can fix anything if we just put our mind to it. We work really hard. A lot of techno optimism kind of takes on this this type of hope, that we can invent technology that will fix everything. And although it is kind of opposite from passive hope in that it requires us to do something to get that outcome, it's still dependent on the outcome that you want. And the problem is, if your hope is based on outcomes and those outcomes don't happen, then you can wade into pessimism and despair and hopelessness. And so the other two types are not outcome dependent. So stoic hope is the idea that we've been through bad things before, we can endure anything, we can rebuild better on the other side. It's more resilient. It's kind of the pessimist perspective, but it doesn't particularly lend itself to being proactive or strategic. And the thing that really resonated to me was the fourth kind, which is grounded hope, which is where I try to operate from most of the time in this job. And the key difference between this and the first two kinds is it's not dependent on outcomes. It's based on, and this is a quote from the last president of Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel, which is Czechoslovakia is where my maternal grandmother was from. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. And as the author Andrew Boyd put it, one should do what is right and what is necessary, and the doing and the walking are their own reward. So that, I think practicing that kind of grounded hope is the version that is most useful for me in my work. Most of the time, frankly, I think there are some situations where the other three may have a useful role to play as well. But that idea that, I'm going to be doing my best to change at least something for someone and make it better for them is motivating. So I will stop there and encourage everyone to check out the link and hopefully read the book. And there are a whole bunch of other good recommendations of other thinkers in this area from a whole wide range of perspectives. Some very optimistic, some very pessimistic, but all very interesting. So I'll turn it over.
Turning it over to me. Hey, y'all. Sarah Corcoran. I'm the deputy director here at the chapter, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm going to focus more on my own personal coping mechanisms and ways that I am moving forward in these trying times. It's tough. I want to be real with y'all. We're dealing with a lot of stuff right now. And the fact that so many of you are on the screen right now sharing this vulnerability with us is proof of that, right? And it's really, really, really easy to get overwhelmed. You see everything that's coming out on the news, you see everything that's coming out on social media, and you're reading the studies, you're reading the posts, and it can be very, very overwhelming. One thing that I do as a bit of a neurospicy person is I make a lot of checklists. And the to-do lists kind of focus it down a little bit for me. These are the tangibles that I can actually achieve, right? Because if you're looking at, oh, there's so many things that need to be done in order for us to affect change, you're going to miss out on the actions that you can make, right? So focus on the small things and get through, okay, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. And suddenly you've made change, right? Suddenly you have moved forward on your goals without having all of the miasma of the overwhelmingness hanging over your head. And it might not work for everyone. That's totally fine. But if you can focus on the tangible change, then you're less likely to get overwhelmed, right? What brings me hope, as Tom had said, it's partly y'all and it's partly the movement in general, right? Us as individuals, we swell like an ocean. We are a bunch of if you've seen the images where it's the tiny little minnows that all school together to be the giant fish, um that's us, and I've seen movement building. I've seen folks on the ground get together and they get angry, and anger is an emotion. It's on that wheel, right? They get passionate. They want to affect change. And it's really, really powerful to see this community come together and affect change together as a whole, right? So that's one of those things that really brings me hope in this time, is that we're not alone. We might feel isolated. Pennsylvania is a really big state. But there are other folks. There's faces across the state that are coming together and that are working towards a common goal, a common change. And when you're feeling alone, think about the movement, right? Think about the others who are working towards the same goal as you. And it helps me, it makes me hopeful, and I hope that I hope that helps you as well. I'm gonna pass it off to Melissa so that she can talk before we run out of time.
Thanks, Sarah and Tom. Yes, I will be brief, folks, and then because I do want to have time for questions and discussion. So generally the first thing I asked myself when I am experiencing kind of these feelings of overwhelm and despair, is what can I control and what's out of my control? Because I can easily get distracted and obsessed by what I can't control. I mean, I'm kind of a controlling person in general. So when you layer on like the global impacts of what's happening, it's like I want to fix something that's unfixable. So what can I control? What can't I control? I can't control what's coming out of the White House, but I can control my actions. I can control the phone calls that I make to our elected officials. I can control whether I am asking volunteers and supporters of Sierra Club to also make those calls, right? So I can control that. I can control whether I get off the computer and leave my house and go to a rally or some kind of community event where I'm with other people. So the next part of that, when I'm questioning myself, is what can I control? And then what is the next right action of that bucket of things I can control? So how can I live my values? What's the next thing that I can do that aligns with those values? Even if it's small, it doesn't need to be a major thing, but if I can just do that next right thing. And I believe that most people, you know, that their values that they believe that they hold align with the general concepts we have. How that has manifested in their lives might be different, but I have to believe that there's more of us that are trying to do the right thing in the environmental movement, in the general social justice movements. There are more of us than there are of them who are trying to break things down. They may be loud and right now really powerful, but there are more of us, to Sarah's point about the image with the fish. And I also have to accept that I'm not going to see results in real time. And I think that is something that is really challenging for folks, is like you feel like you're screaming into a void. Did that voicemail you left with that legislator resonate? There is no way for you to know that. Particularly if their votes never seem to go your way, right? Why keep calling? But I have to hope that they do. So talking to you all here, or whoever watches this video, I don't know what kind of impact this webinar is going to have on you, but I have to hope that it has a positive impact, right? So I just have to accept that I'm not going to see results in real time for any of this work. I just have to trust and be okay with the fact that I don't know my impact, but I'm working on progress in some way. And progress, not perfection, because we're also dealing with issues where there is no perfect solution. So I kind of have to be okay in that gray area. And then the last thing I'll say is sometimes I just put my oxygen mask on first, and I'm terrible at that. I'm terrible at that. I certainly go through periods where I feel like if I am not working, then I'm wasting my time by not making things better all the time, right? But you can't get water out of an empty well. Drought, eco metaphor. If there's nothing in me to give, or what is in me is poisoned, I'm not going to be doing great work anyway. So sometimes I just have to be like, it's okay to watch a movie that has nothing to do with the environment or justice. I'm a big fan of horror. Which there's a whole philosophy out there about horror as an emotional catharsis type of thing. So clearly there's something going on there with me, but that is my guilty pleasure, is to jump into horror. Yeah, and ultimately their goal, the amorphous they, is to drive us apart, right? But if we're not isolating, if we're coming together, then we can counter this. So there's my brief, I'm always happy to have this conversation with folks. I have been having this conversation with volunteers, right? Pretty much since the election happened. So please feel free to reach out to any of us if you want to chat. Again, acknowledging that we're not therapists. Bailey is a social worker for realsies, but the rest of us are not. And I do have a quick slide of reading recommendations for you all, and then we're going to turn it over. We have a little bit of time to hear from anybody else who would like to talk. So let me real quick show our book list. All right, so we have I Want a Better Catastrophe, which, now the graphic's not showing up, but that is the one that Tom recommended. We have Not Too Late, Changing the Climate Story from Despair to Possibility, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet, Active Hope, How to Face the Mess We're In with Unexpected Resilience and Creative Power, and Lifehouse, Taking Care of Ourselves in a World on Fire. You're going to get these slides as well, so you will be able to see this reading list. Pick up these books at your local library, go libraries, or your local independent bookstore, because that's the coolest. Okay, so I'm going to stop screen sharing. Kelsey, if you're willing to moderate, I can help out with that as well. Do we have anything in the chat that we need to address that came in? Nope, nothing that.
No, just to share, Bailey shared, when you were talking, Melissa, a locus of control can be a very helpful visual reminder, and posted a link. So there's another resource in there for that. And Bailey, I don't know if you want to speak any more to that, but I did just want to mention that there was another resource that Bailey put in the chat.
Yeah, Melissa, you were like a therapist's dream with setting some of this stuff up. But the locus of control looks at like what you can control in the center, what you can influence, and then what's outside of your control. And a lot of times, if I have a group that's really overwhelmed, like they've been fighting a particular site fight for a long time or a stressor for a long time, we'll just go through that locus of control, and it can be really helpful and freeing to like focus their energy on, yeah, look at you, Kelsey, on like what can I control and what can I influence, and then like what's outside of that. It also helps to not give up because like just because you don't have control over something doesn't mean you don't have influence over something. And then Melissa, you also mentioned like values aligned action. There's a whole branch of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy that's really beautiful, and I have found really helpful for folks feeling climate distress. So if you're looking for a therapist, I highly recommend, related to climate distress, I really recommend therapists that are trained in acceptance and commitment therapy. And it really just looks at like we experience a lot less emotional distress when we're able to identify our values and take values aligned action. And so it is a really, there's more to that therapy branch than just that, but both of those are really beautiful and can be really helpful when we're feeling overwhelmed by the state of the climate or our communities.